The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to another series of webinars being hosted by the National Association of Regional Councils on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Marge Boat. I'm a council member from the city of Olathe, Kansas, and president of the National Association of Regional Councils. I will serve today as your moderator. Today's webinar will focus on the fiscal impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on cities, counties, and regions. As all of you know, the pandemic is having a significant impact on every city and county in America and their regions. City, county, and regional finances are taking a tremendous hit as consumer spending and the resulting revenues just decrease dramatically. Despite repeated requests for assistance from the federal government for aid, these requests appear to be falling on some deaf ears in Congress and in the administration. Today, we are joined by two experts on the fiscal impact of COVID-19 on cities, counties, and regions. They're here to help us better understand the challenges that regions are facing as they continue to meet the needs of their citizenry while facing significant losses in revenues. Our experts are Emily Brock, who is the director for the Federal Liaison Center of the Government Finance Officers Association, and Ray Major, Chief Data and Analytics Officer and Chief Economist for the San Diego Association of Governments. As we all know, the closings of restaurants, shops, gyms, entertainment venues, hotels, and so forth has had a huge impact on our local areas and regions. Most of us are anxious to see the nation reopen, but we also want the nation to act with caution so as to avoid the possibility of a second or even third surge of the virus. And every day, the headlines remind us of the cost, whether to business, government, or our citizens. And I have mentioned prior to coming on that our city, the city of Olathe, which is a city just short of 150,000 citizens, we right now are looking at a deficit for 2020 of $18 million. And we know there will also be a deficit for 2021. We haven't gone beyond that, but we know that all of us are going to be looking at these deficits and the struggles and how to work with that. Before turning the mic over to our presenters, I wanted to let you know that there will be a question and answer period at the end of this presentation. Please enter your questions in the question box in the panel on the right-hand side of your screen. At the conclusion of the presentations, we'll review the questions with our panelists. Now let's go on with our presentations. I'd like to begin by introducing our first speaker, Emily Brock, from the Government Finance Officers Association. Emily, welcome and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Marge. It's my pleasure to be here, and it's especially my pleasure because I know we have a lot of mutual members, and we do continue to press forward in a very strong coalition with all of our efforts in Washington, D.C. as the federal government continues to grapple with ways to assist and help state, local, and regional governments in very effective ways. So thank you for that. I wanted to start out my presentation with a really quick market overview. Next slide, please. We have had, I think, a panic in our market, a panic in all markets across the country and across the world, really. Next slide, please. What we saw in mid-March, obviously, was a fair amount of volatility. Probably the most press was paid attention to the volatility in the equity space, and certainly the volatility in the corporate fund market. But just as those two experienced a bit of volatility in mid-March, so too did the municipal bond market. I put a slide, just a tracking that I did early this morning, put it as particular CUSIP into Excel just to show you the volatility that we experienced in March 2020. As you can see, this is tracking what are called the variable rate demand notes, or what finance officers call the short end of the yield curve. So really at the beginning of the yield curve, these are instruments that are issued out to the public market that can be reset daily, and they can be reset weekly. But as you can see, right around mid-March, we saw a spike that we have never seen before in the short end of the yield curve of the municipal bond market. At that point in time, what was happening across equities, across corporate, and of course across municipal bond markets was that there were a lot of investors who were standing on the sidelines for obvious reasons. It's for an investor to hold on to their cash is no surprise, certainly in an environment where there is historic levels of volatility. Now, the challenge is as we see this spike, we saw that in the short end of the yield curve. But even as those are very short instruments, again, that get reset daily, sometimes weekly, other projects were coming into the municipal space. Other projects that maybe had been on the calendar, we're talking middle schools or public utility, refunding opportunities, they were also coming to market. And they were saying, okay, well, here's my deal. How will my deal be priced? And if you look at that spike in the short end of the yield curve, what a lot of our finance officers were experiencing is volatile pricing for 20-year bonds, 10-year bonds, and much longer bonds that were trying to be placed. And so that gave us a lot of discomfort of placing debt in anywhere in the yield curve, whether it was the short end of the yield curve with temporary instruments, or if it was long 10-year, 20-year, 30-year bonds, there was no movement in our market. And so that presented a major challenge at that period of time, and still to this day, a market seems to be walking on eggshells. Next slide, please. And so, as I mentioned, there are deals that were on the calendar, and these are, your bread and butter general obligation deals that have been shelved. I did a quick and dirty survey of my debt committee. The GFOA, it represents 25 unique regions across the country, and every single one of them had a deal shelved. And what they're doing is they're trying to wait for that volatility to subside so that they have a better understanding when they place their debt for competitive bids. That is, they place the middle school project finance out and they get bids of potential financiers to issue out that project to the public markets. They want to make sure that they get effective pricing. But also, investors are also watching exactly what's happening in Washington right now. You bet they are watching what exactly is being written into the federal legislative efforts to assist state and local governments. They too, as our investors, they want to make sure that the federal, state, and local governments that are accessing capital through the municipal bond market I can't say that they are doing well necessarily, but they want to make sure that they have an understanding of what the bonds are doing and how they are working to help an economy thrive through the challenges that we have ahead of us. Next slide, please. So what are the ways that the federal government has come to the fore to help to address the challenges at state and local government? Well, a few weeks back, the very first, actually it was the second stimulus bill called the Families First Coronavirus Relief Act. And that was a piece of legislation that was introduced in the House. And as you recall, it introduced a component of paid sick leave for all employers across the country. It required for 2 weeks of additional paid sick leave as a result of COVID-related illnesses. In the Families First Coronavirus Relief Act, it required that paid sick leave, but then it provided a refundable tax credit for the private employers who had been identified in the FFCRA. But one of the challenges for us is that it prohibits public employers from eligibility of that refundable tax credit. We tried to make it clear to the House as they were passing this legislation that state and local governments do collectively employ millions of individuals, and about 75% of public employers across the United States do in fact pay Social Security. And so this is a significant, I think, oversight of the House. We have been working quite a bit with House champions to introduce a piece of legislation that would reverse that prohibition, that again, it would allow for public employers to receive that refundable, to be eligible to receive that refundable tax credit. Next slide, please. So about 5 days later, as we were all learning how to work from our dining room tables, the CARES Act was quickly in development. The CARES Act, as you recall, was then the Senate's response to the coronavirus challenge that we have ahead of us. And there were two components that GFOA and our coalition with NARC had paid attention to. That was the two important elements are direct funding or grant funding, and the other element was any kind of capital or lending capabilities that the federal government might have to assist with state and local government efforts. So let's pay attention to the former first. So CARES, pretty famously, as of last week, opened up a portal in the United States Treasury that allowed for eligible entities that are eligible to receive the $150 billion Coronavirus Relief Fund, or the CRF. They opened up the portal so that everyone could put in their applications and that they then would receive the allocation of the $150 billion directly to them. So eligible entities, who are they? Well, all 50 states are eligible to receive a portion of that $150 billion. And then local governments are qualified if they have a population of over 500,000 people. There are unique circumstances, and I think you all know this very well, where there are combined governments or cities and counties have unique relationships that don't make them separate and distinct. However, the United States Treasury did not see it that way. They have set specific parameters and guidelines around eligible entities, especially eligible entities when it comes to counting heads. For example, Mecklenburg County surrounding Charlotte, North Carolina, the application actually goes to Charlotte, North Carolina because Charlotte, North Carolina had the majority of the population. Then a derivative of the eligible population will go to Mecklenburg County. The other challenge, I think, with the $150 billion is that a lot of people are scratching their heads now of those eligible entities on what is exactly a COVID-related expense. The Treasury and the statute makes it very clear that the funds may only be spent on COVID-related expenses when the eligible entity submits the receipts on December 31st, 2020. We have not received the guidelines on that yet, but we certainly are asking Treasury for more illustration. Certainly as those eligible entities are starting to spend that money that they are now in receipt of. Next slide, please. So also the CARES Act directly impacts the municipal bond market. In the CARES Act, I think it's page like 587, but who's counting? It's section 4003, section B4, where there is an allocation or an appropriations of $454 billion. And we worked really hard to try to get in the act an opportunity for states and local governments to have some flexibility in their access to the municipal bond market. And what we asked was, how might the federal government play that role? Could they directly lend to state and local governments, or could they act as an investor in our market, like as if they were a vanguard. They too could come to the secondary market and buy up securities and kind of allow for the stillness that's happened and created that sort of peak in the interest rates to be shaken up, sort of an Econ 101, create supply and demand again that would allow for preferential pricing among the folks approaching the municipal bond market. And so that's what we wrote into the CARES Act. And next slide, please. This is what they came up with. Their interpretation of 4003, that is the Federal Reserve's interpretation of 4003, is what's called the Municipal Liquidity Fund. What the Municipal Liquidity Fund does is it provides up to $500 billion to states and cities whose population is over 1 million, counties whose population is over 2 million, for them to borrow up to 20% of their general fund revenue. So, for example, if a state's general fund revenue allocation is $100 billion, they could borrow $20 billion. The terms on that are that you can only borrow those funds for 24 months. That is, they are completely redeemable within 24 months. So it is very much a short-term lending capacity of the federal government. The states and the cities and the counties are the ones who have direct access to the Federal Reserve to access these funds, that is, to borrow from the federal government. But also in the term sheet, the Municipal Liquidity Fund allows for eligible entities, states and large cities and large counties, to borrow on behalf of instrumentalities or political subdivisions. So again, we don't have entirely what those definitions are, but the assumption is that the state of Minnesota, for example, may be able to borrow on behalf of cities or counties that are less than those eligible entities' population. And in addition, they can borrow on behalf of school districts or water systems or any other political subdivision. This is the first time in the history that we have seen the federal government lend directly to state and local governments. And to put it simply, to use sort of a metaphor, everybody's got a dog these days, as you know. We're all out and healthily walking within safe distance. So this first picture is an example of all the dogs feeding together. That is, they have access to kibble or access to capital in their financial institutions. So all of the eligible entities certainly have access to borrow from, say, Bank of America or from Citigroup, a line of credit that would sustain them for 24 months. But also, states and local governments have access. Those who have the permission to, and the statutes in their states, they have access to borrow short-term capital from the municipal bond market. So as I mentioned before, those VRDNs. So there's capacity in the financial institutions, and there's also capacity in the bond market. But what the Municipal Liquidity Fund does is it actually sets out a third bowl of kibble. That is, it's trying to get the Great Danes and the Rottweilers out of the smaller dog's kibble bowl. They're trying to provide them another source of capital that they then would be able to sustain themselves for 24 months. That is the ultimate reality, the ultimate goal of the Municipal Liquidity Fund, is to create a third funding source for the big dogs in our market. Does that help? We're certainly trying to ensure that the parameters around the Municipal Liquidity Fund actually entice the Great Danes to go eat from that third kibble bowl. They are trying to make sure that the pricing could be market-based, that the terms are not onerous, and that it's not instinctively higher cost, for the Great Danes and the Rottweilers to go eat from that third bowl of kibble. So it makes sense the way that they've approached it. They are addressing our most immediate liquidity needs. But that's the current reality of where we are with the Municipal Liquidity Fund, with still details to be shaken out. Next slide, please. So what's next? As we said, we have our foot both in direct funding and in access to capital. So the direct funding, again, that $150 billion Coronavirus Relief Act, we want to see more. Right now, the leadership is actually noodling ways that they may be able to expand the PPP program, that is the direct lending program to small businesses, to increase where there is demand. But in addition, we're trying to make sure that they understand the importance of state and local governments, that $150 billion really didn't scratch the surface. And we need to be considered for any 3.5 stimulus funding. In addition, if we don't make it into the CARES 3.5 funding, we certainly are going to make sure that we are queued up for CARES 4. There's also another proposal floating around the House and the Senate right now that would be a CARES style funding, but it would be very specifically allocated to those entities who are below that 500,000 population restriction that was attached to the original CARES Act. So there are proposals. We have advocates in bicameral advocates, leadership advocates, and we have a lot of motivation to ensure that state and local governments are in receipt of more direct funding in subsequent CARES Acts. Next slide, please. What's next for borrowing or capital access? Well, the Municipal Liquidity Fund, as I mentioned, we're still waiting on Q&A from the Fed. We need more details. Obviously, we want to make sure that where we entice those bigger dogs to eat from that third bowl, that they are motivated to do so. And because of that, we're going to have to make sure that the Municipal Liquidity Fund prices like the market. We have to make sure that it's not penalty priced for the big dogs to actually relieve the pressure, relieve the stress on the two other sources of capital. We want to make sure that the eligibility is expanded. GFOA has a significant amount of members who are above and beyond, certainly with populations under that 1 million and 2 million person threshold, but also public utilities and entities with enormous tax bases that don't necessarily have populations assigned to them. So we want to try to expand that eligibility. And third, we want to make sure that the timing, although we still have a lot of questions, time is something we don't have to waste here. And I think that the Fed, actually, I know that the Fed absolutely knows that. So that to the best of their ability, we hope that they may be able to ensure that, that this program is laid out, that is effective, and that it's usable in order to ensure its policy objective. Last but not least, there are letters circulating right now on how to improve the municipal liquidity facility, but also there are champions in the Senate, Senator Menendez, Senator Tillis out of North Carolina, Senator Kennedy out of Louisiana. There's also letters in the House, Congressman Stivers out of Ohio, Congressman Ruppersberger out of Maryland, are all writing letters to the Fed to encourage them to participate in our market as an investor. Again, trying to concentrate and relieve the pressure on all ends of the yield curve, both the short end and the tail, just so that we have the capacity to place those long bonds when we need to, because there is a lot of pressure on our infrastructure happening right now, and we need to make sure we have a working capital markets to access as we look forward to sustaining through the challenges ahead of us and recovering when that time comes. Next slide, please. And so last but not least, 3.5 is under deliberation today. I was surprised I didn't actually see some headlines of it passing or at least approaching the floor. I think we will see it either today or early tomorrow. And the House is actually deliberating a fourth stimulus. Several times the Coalition, the Public Finance Network, has been called by the Ways and Means Committee and the House Financial Services Committee. So again, the challenge right now, since CARES was passed by the Senate, the next bill will be the House's bill. And so we're receiving a lot of calls from congressmen, from House leadership, trying to make sure that they encompass everything that they need to do in C4, because there's a lot of folks, I think, and there's a lot of sentiment on the Hill that this is our last shot, and we need to make sure that we make it effective. So you can see that there are a lot of congressmen who are on our team. They want to ensure that there is direct funding for state and local governments and political subdivisions underneath those local governments who fall under the 500,000 population threshold. They wanted to make sure that there is a secondary purchasing facility set up by the Federal Reserve so that there is opportunity for them to relieve the pressure in the municipal bond market. They are also very interested in advancing our efforts to put the tools back in the toolkit that would allow for efficiency in infrastructure investment, such as the advancer funding of municipal bonds. They want to make sure that small regionals have access to bank qualified bonds, and they want to make sure that there's the capacity to sequester-proof issue a potential direct pay bonds facility. So all of these conversations are coming up. I think they will end up in the fourth package, but I still think that there is a fair amount of conversation going on about how to position them and how to ensure their success, because again, time is not what we have right now. Next slide, please. And so with that, I just want to thank you all for your time. Certainly happy to answer your questions after the next presenter is done.
Emily, thank you so much. Excellent presentation. Really, as always, it's a moving target. And so getting to learn more about what's going on hour by hour, actually, is very, very helpful to us. So again, thank you very much. And as you mentioned, anyone that has questions, please submit them under the questions panel box there, and we'll address them at the end of the next presentation. And now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Ray Major of the San Diego Association of Governments. Thank you, Ray, for being with us today.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the time that I'm going to be spending with you, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit about a model that we put together. And I'm going to put out there the offer now for anybody who might be interested in potentially using and modifying our model to try to understand the short-term impacts on your individual budgets. I'm putting that offer out there now. We'd love to work with you to offer that model. Next slide, please. You know, quantifying the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic is extremely difficult, and as an MPO here in California, you know, one of the things that I was tasked with was really to try to understand what the impact was going to be on our sales tax revenue, and this really was for short-term budgeting needs. So we needed to know what was it going to do to our FY 2020 budget, and what was it going to do to FY 21, and if it was going to be longer than that, boy, what was going to happen then. I think there's a couple things that we have to remember while we're doing these type of analyses, and I'm sure you're all struggling with the same thing. I mean, these are unprecedented times, and the data that you look at is completely unrecognizable, whether it's unemployment data or it's data related to, you know, reduction in retail sales, that type of thing. And so it's very difficult to do a point forecast and come up with a singular number. And as an economist, I mean, that's what I'm used to doing. That's what most people are still looking at. So they'll put out a number saying, you know, the economy is going to go down by 24% in the next quarter, something like that. And then they'll put a range on it. They'll say, you know, and plus minus 10%. And unfortunately, with these times where the variables going into it are so fluid, it's very, very difficult to come up with one number for budgeting reasons. And I know when it gets to the accounting part, like our CFO he says, give me the number, one number. And that makes it really difficult. But when I talk to our board of directors, what I want them to understand is that there are a lot of moving parts here. You know, the length of this disruption has not been determined yet. Originally, it was going to be a 2-week shutdown in the middle of May, starting in the middle of March and ending in April, and then it was the end of April, and now it's the mid-May, and now it's different states at different times. So understanding that is a huge variable. The depth and severity of any recession that would come out of this is also another big variable that we just don't know yet, and a lot of it has to do with how fast we come back to work, what the rules are of engagement. And then you've heard economists talk about a V-shaped recovery, and then you may have heard of U-shaped recoveries and all these different type of recoveries. And how we come out of this economic mess is going to really depend, it's going to have a huge impact on the amount of revenue that we lose, especially from places like sales tax. So how do you come up with a model that can forecast all this stuff when everything is a moving part? Next slide, please. So essentially, the model, instead of coming up with one number, what it does is it comes up with 40 different models that are all based upon a bunch of different inputs. And so I will show you in a little while what the results are, and it basically just comes out in a matrix. And then we kind of assign probabilities to what the most likely scenario is based upon what we're hearing in the news. And then that kind of gives us a probability or a range of what's going to happen. But the model works in a couple of dimensions. So it's looking at the length of the disruption, which could be anywhere from 2 to 6 months. We can obviously extend this. I hope not. March 15th was the start date of our disruption. So just for purposes, this goes out to like August or September. The depth of the recession that's going to occur from this, whether it's mild, moderate, or severe, and then the shape of the recovery. So we're looking at V-shaped recoveries, long Vs, Us, or Nike swooshes, and U-longs, and all sorts of different shapes. And each one of them have significant impacts. And depending upon which combination you use, the situation is anywhere from bad to really, really bad. And so if you hit the next slide, I want to show you how the model works. And if you have this type of information, then we can certainly give you this spreadsheet. You can modify the inputs on the screen and come up with these forecasts. So what our model works on is a couple of things. One, we look at what our baseline forecast is. So from essentially from fiscal year 2018 through 2030. So those are numbers that you kind of need to provide. We have a forecast that that we do, and these are the numbers of what we believe our sales tax revenue would have been for the next 10 years. So that's one thing you need to put in there. If you have historical data, that helps just with the visualizations. The second thing is where your sales tax is coming from. If you are a jurisdiction that collects sales tax, for instance, ours is broken up into these categories, and others might break these up differently. I know that there's each state might be somehow different. We work with a company called Muni Services or Avenue that breaks them into these categories. This is how we track them. And what we do here is essentially look at what percentage of our sales tax is coming from all of these different categories. And the reason we want to do that is that we are going to make assumptions in terms of how hard each one of these categories are hit, and that's what's going to really drive our model. So our 2020 forecast, FY 2020 forecast, was that our sales tax revenue would amount to about $319 million. So that number is carried from the blue side, or the blue input. It populates over here. The green numbers that we filled in over here, these are the colored ones, are the input cells, are the percentage of revenue that comes from each one of those sectors. And then the next one over, the orange section, is really the impact that this COVID-19 is having on each sector. So we are doing primary data collection, but there's also a lot of anecdotal information, and there's information coming in from the state too that is starting to allow us to understand how much each of these different sectors is being impacted. So for instance, apparel stores, the sales are down by about 75%, primarily because of the fact that most of them are closed. So we expect to be getting about 25% of the apparel store sales tax revenue that we had previously gotten for this forecast model. And you can see department stores, we believe it's about 50%, et cetera. So those are inputs that are put into the model. The last input is just a correction for the fiscal year, because it turns out that this pandemic spans 2 fiscal years for us, both FY 2020 and FY 2021. And so unlike the calendar year, which is what most of the data is that you hear when people say third quarter is going to be down, fourth quarter is going to be up, or whatever, those are calendar years. And for accounting purposes, if you're using fiscal year, this is how you would make the adjustment for the fiscal year, which is when you started the lockdown, how many of those months were actually in fiscal 2020. So that's all you need for the input for the model. Next slide, please. The way that we calibrated the model is that we took a look at our sales tax revenue collection from our half-cent sales tax that we administer, which is called Transnet. That's the name on the slide here. But what we did is we went back and we took a look at the last couple of recessions to understand what was the impact on our revenue. This tracks retail sales very closely, obviously, because it's sales tax on retail sales. We looked at the 1991 recession. That really constitutes kind of a moderate recession. It took us about 4 years to recover our revenue when we went into that recession. In 2021, or the dot-com bust, we had a mild recession where our rate of increase in sales tax collection went down, but we actually didn't lose any, in raw numbers, it actually didn't go down in the previous year. So that's kind of this mild recession scenario where things kind of slow down. And then we used the Great Recession as a model for the severe recession in terms of how long it would take to recover from that. Next slide, please. And again, I kind of went over this on the input to the model slide, but this kind of shows what our original thinking was in terms of how hard sectors are being hit. Here in San Diego, the retail sectors are being hit extremely hard, except for drugstores, which had increase in revenues, and miscellaneous retail, which includes Amazon. And so you saw an increase there. In terms of the food markets at that time, we saw a huge increase in food markets as people were in the stores stocking up, and we saw liquor store sales increase also. Restaurants were pummeled. But in that particular case, what we've seen early now here in April is that food markets have come down more to a normal baseline, possibly because people have purchased everything they need, but also because you also have social distancing going on, so they're not letting as many people into the stores, so their volume or throughput is less than it was previously. And you see our transportation industry, especially used car sales, were decimated, as were service stations. The sales tax on gasoline has gone down significantly. So this is what we were using as inputs. It's probably, it's very close to other areas in California. I don't know how close this is to other areas in the nation, but I would assume that if you use this as a starting point and kind of worked with the specific sectors, you might be very similar in terms of the numbers that we're seeing. So next slide, please. So how does the factors that we talked about impact the revenue coming into the region? And so what I wanted to show, and these slides are from the report that I did to our board of directors to help them understand what the range of possibilities were depending upon the inputs. We showed this slide. So if you could click, please. This is our historical data collection in terms of sales tax, in terms of taxable retail sales in the region. You see the 2009, that was the Great Recession, so it dropped. If you click again, this shows a kind of a straight line forecast of what taxable retails could be if we did not go into another recession. If you click one more time, what this was trying to explain is what would be the impact if we had a 2-month recession, or 2-month, not sorry, it was a 2-month disruption. We had a moderate recession and a V-shaped recovery. How much sales tax would we lose? How much retail sales would we lose? And in our case, we would lose about $10 billion in retail sales. Click again, please. This shows the scenario where we go into a moderate recession, but we have a 3-month disruption, and it's a longer V to recover. And in this case, you see that it's almost 60% more in terms of the amount of revenue we lose, and now it's pushing us all the way out till 2023 before we recover. Another click, please. If we go into a moderate recession, but we have a U-shaped recovery, and we're essentially closed down for 4 months, then what will happen is that we would lose about $36.5 billion in taxable retail sales, and you see that the economy probably wouldn't recover till about 2026, and so we'd be expecting lower revenues for a significant amount of time. And if you click one more time, just for comparison's sake, I wanted to show what it would look like if the Great Recession, if we just modeled the Great Recession and its loss in revenue, and you'd see something like this. So that's kind of akin to, if you look at where 2009 is, from 2007 2009, and you superimpose those numbers, this is the type of forecast you would get. My point here is that it's very difficult to come up with one number. We can come up with anywhere from $10 billion to $110 billion in loss by simply varying a couple of things, and that's how long is it going to take us to come out of the recession, and how long are we going to be disrupted as an economy. So this is why I started doing the forecast in ranges. Next slide, please. This graph is going to show what the impact is on our sales tax revenue. So this is revenue to our jurisdiction. This is the pre-COVID-19 forecast, just zooming into 2016 through 2026. Click again, please. This would have been, had we just had that 2-week, everybody talked about, we're going to shelter in place for 2 weeks, so we're going to come back to work. We really wouldn't have fallen into a recession, and we would have had this V recovery. We would have lost $27 million in revenue. Click again. This is the moderate scenario that I believe is more likely, and it would result in a loss of about $50 million in revenue. If you click again, you see what happens if we go into a severe recession with a U-shaped recovery. We'd lose $273 million. Click again. This models the Great Recession for a $500 million loss. And if you click again, just to show what it would look like if this went into a depression, we would lose about $1.2 billion in sales tax revenue. And that would be a significant part. We have about $12 billion left in collections on this current measure, so it would be about a 10% hit for the life of the measure. Again, I don't believe that we're going to go into anything that's nearly as dire as a Great Recession or Great Depression. That's why they're in dotted lines, but I put it on here so that I can show the board of directors that we are in fact looking at all these different scenarios. And you know, there's a lot of talk out of there that this is the next depression. Well, then this is what it looks like. If you hit it one more time, and then if you can just click through this one until it's finished. One of the things that we did is we validated our forecast against national forecasts everywhere from Oxford University, UCLA, Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, everyone who's we could get our hands on. And our forecast pretty much is right in the middle of those. So those forecasts at the end of March were coming back with between 2% and 14% reductions in GDP in the third quarter. And some of those have been revised downward, and so we continue to revise our model downward too. But this just validates that our model is pretty much following national models. If you click again, this graph simply shows that, and this is a complicated concept for our board to understand, but in terms of fiscal year, we were doing very well for the first 9 months of fiscal 2020. The crisis occurred in March. Revenue collections are down in April. There's a 2-month delay in us getting our revenue. So essentially, we're getting full collections for February and April. We'll get hit for only 2 months this fiscal year, and then more months in fiscal 2021. My point is that this recession, or this the impact is split over 2 fiscal years, and that is a concept that was difficult for us to understand. And I don't know, maybe some of you are struggling with it also. Click again, please. Okay, so these are the results of the model, and this is how it comes out. And I'm sorry about some of the colors. They didn't translate over very well when we sent the slide deck over. But basically what happens is that we have a grid here, and it shows across the top the disruption starting in March 15th and ending in our best case scenario was May 15th, we'd be back to work. That was a 2-month disruption all the way through September. And then you see the impact. So there was a COVID-only impact without going into a recession, a mild impact, a mild recession with a V-shaped recovery, moderate recession with a V-shaped recovery, V-shaped long, et cetera, going into a severe recession. And the next column over shows you when we expect the economy to recover. And then the grid shows the probabilities that I was assigning based upon what we knew. So this one was at the beginning of April. At the beginning of April, the federal government was still saying we would be back to work at the end of April. So what that means is that we could have gone back to work by May 15th, so that it was highly likely that we would have a moderate recession with a V-shaped recovery, and equally so, there were a lot of places saying they would be shut down longer, probably into the middle of May, and therefore we wouldn't be back to work till June 15th. So we also gave a relatively high probability to a comeback in June 15th with a moderate V-shaped recovery. And as you can see, the black numbers are the ones that I believe are probably realistic. The ones in gray, I do not believe are realistic anymore. And the reason is that I don't believe that we're not going to have a recession, for instance. So scenario A is no longer even on the table. The longer that we stay shut down as an economy, the more chance it is that we will go into a deeper recession. So that's why you see some of these scenarios, like if we're shut down for 5 months, I don't believe that it will only be a mild recession. So you see that those things are grayed out also. So this is starting to build this probability of what could potentially happen in terms of loss of revenue. So we budgeted to losing $81.6 million and because we need a single number for our budget. But I give that about a 40% probability that our loss would be somewhere between $50 million and $200 million. So the elected officials understand that we may have to come back on a quarterly basis and revise our budgets as we get more data. If you hit the slide one more time, and this is my last slide, the colors got messed up over here, but what this one is my latest update. And in California, our governor has said that we won't be coming back to work, definitely not at the end of the month. So that pretty much makes the 2-month scenario not feasible anymore. So it makes it much more likely that we'll be getting back to work sometime by June 15th, and that we will be going into a recession. If we don't have a good way to get back, and social distancing is still a big issue, and people are going to have to, wear masks, and we can't resume activities the way that we did, we could probably have a recession that has a relatively long recovery curve until we can get back to what would be considered normal. And some of this depends upon the testing and vaccine too. So as you can see, there's a higher probability, I believe, that we will be losing somewhere around $183 million, whereas just 2 weeks ago we were looking at like $81 million. So this is how we use the tool here in San Diego. Again, thank you very much for listening, and I would again like to offer this model to anybody who might be struggling with trying to figure out how to put some type of parameters around what the loss would be in your individual regions. Thank you.
Thanks, Ray. That was excellent. I know that I'm going to get our staff from the city to be in touch. It is pretty significant when you look at the length of the disruptions and how the impact would be on your budgets. It's phenomenal, and I'm with you. I'm hoping we'll not get to where we are in the case of a depression. That is something we definitely want to avoid. Again, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Now I want to go ahead and open the webinar to questions and answers. Please make sure that you've entered your question in the panel on the right-hand side of your screen. And Macy Moran of the NARC staff will be asking our presenters your questions. Macy, go ahead.
Thanks, Marge. Okay, you moved it. I don't have any questions yet, but there was a question asked earlier that asked when the program will be distributed. So we just want to let you all know that we are recording this webinar, and we will send that as well as the PowerPoint presentation in an email to everyone who registered tomorrow via GoToWebinar. So you should get an email from GoToWebinar about 2 or 3 p.m. Eastern time with those links. So
Thank you, Meg.
Sure. Next question. How quickly can SANDAG adjust the model and make runs? Is it pretty fast or does it take a few days?
It's very quick. This is really a spreadsheet model. We try to keep it simple because of how dynamic it is. So for instance, what we're doing right now is based upon some surveys that we're doing of local businesses. We're calling our top 100 contributors to sales tax revenue to see if they're open or closed, if they're and trying to get an understanding of how much their sales have been impacted. We will go in, simply change those factors in the model, and it'll reproduce the numbers for us. Included in the model is a tab that has a bunch of graphs that are associated with it, so that we can use those also in the reporting. So it's really just a matter of minutes to rerun the model.
Great, thank you. Well, Marge, I think that's all the questions I have on my end. Oh, wait, sorry, there's one more. Has SANDAG also looked at declines in property values, which may happen further downstream?
No, not with this particular model. What we are going to start looking at the larger economic impacts, including looking at things like a bump when we come out of those stay-at-home orders. This is really for short-term analysis for budgeting, so that we can give elected officials a understanding of what the possible impact is going to be. And so it's very much focused on that right now. We'll be looking at the other aspects of what go into property values and things like that also as we move forward and recast our long-term forecast.
Great. Next question. What % of the budget comes just from sales tax?
Of our budget? That's a difficult question because we get federal and state funding, and so what this does is it really impacts a lot of the projects that we have that we're building. It probably, as a percentage, it's probably 10 or 20% of our budget.
Great. Next question. How are the recovery projections impacted if and when COVID picks back up in the fall and winter? Even if it's only a 2 or 3 months shutdown now, we will be looking at a minimum of 2 to 3 months in the fall and winter.
Well, currently, this doesn't have a W-shaped recovery, which is the one that would probably model best a shutdown in the fall. So what I would do if somebody asked me what that would look like, I would probably look at the scenarios that were either the U-shaped recovery, which kind of keeps the economy subdued for a relatively long period of time, like for the next year, or a long U, which would be for the next couple of years. I think that if it does look like we're going to reopen, a vaccine is not out in the market and tests are not out where people can figure out if they have immunity, we will go in and we'll do a model for a W-shaped recovery.
Thank you. Next question. Can you speculate about the fiscal ability of the federal government to continue to provide long-term revenue replacement if we have a longer recession?
I
don't think that question was meant for me, but I think it was.
I was muting and unmuting over and over. I apologize. I think we have a very alert Congress right now, and I think that they know that even though I had suggested that maybe C4 is our last bite at the apple, I do think that they are very much aware that there is a lag in and a complete in many regions, complete void of the collection of revenues necessary to provide essential public services. So I think we do have an alert Congress that does understand that there is a bit of a lag. But I guess, again, it's going to have to take proving to both Congress and to the executive of the dire situation that our localities are facing, because obviously there is a lag in revenues receipts that we are going to be seeing over the next several years, at least 24 months, if not longer, obviously. So yes, I do think that there will be a Congress that's alert to what's coming ahead. And I do think that it's going to take all of our efforts to continue to make sure to remind them that there's significant challenges that we will experience for the next several years to come.
Great, thank you. Next question is, have you looked at the impact of logistics and cargo?
No, if you're talking about my model, no, we have not looked at the impact of logistics and cargo in this model. We started with looking at taxable retail sales. What we are starting to see, though, is that the supply chain is also being disrupted. And so where that would be kind of worked into the model is that I think certain sectors of the economy would be impacted more than others, and we might be able to make some adjustments there. But as of right now, we do not have that in this model.
Thank you. And seeing that we're at 3 o'clock and we don't have any more questions, I will pass it back over to Marge to close.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ray, Emily, Macy, and everyone who participated this afternoon. For even more information, go to the NARC's webpage on COVID-19, which will provide a wide range of information that you may find helpful. In addition, we've posted the COVID-19 information pages from the GFOA and SANDAG websites. So, and in addition, as Macy said, expect an email that will provide access to this information for your review again, or to pass on to others that maybe have not been able to attend today. As we say at the conclusion of every webinar, we'd like to remind you that NARC would like to act as a repository for policies and practices, statements developed by regions, municipalities, counties, and states, and that we'll post on our COVID-19 webpage for the benefit of all. We are all going to learn together during this trying time. You'll forward those documents to Jessica Rutzine at jessica@narc.org. And now, once again, thank you to Emily and Ray for those excellent presentations. And I, again, want to thank all of you for joining us today. Be safe, be healthy, have a good afternoon.